I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, and I'm also a Professor of English, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to the campus series, Berkeley Writers at Work. Since its inauguration in 1997, this series is focused not on faculty as researchers and thinkers, but on faculty as writers. We've learned that Ram Takaki has gotten some of his best ideas while surfing. That's the ocean, not the web. That Nancy Shepherd-Hughes takes pictures of her anthropological subjects to her computer and writes with them as her audience. That Robin Lakoff would like to write all of her books and articles at Chez Panisse. He's so hot. That Fred Cruz thinks our writing becomes something better than ourselves. As an academic community, we share the fact that we're all writers. Writing is in some ways the most public thing we do, and it's also the most private. Where do you write? What do you write on? What do you write with? How do you generate ideas and structure? When do you decide you're finished? Who do you show your writing to as you create a piece? It gives me particular pleasure today to introduce Bharati Mukherjee as the featured writer in this semester's Writers at Work, for she's a colleague of mine in the English department. Bharati was born in Calcutta. She received her MA from the University of Baroda and her MFA and PhD from the University of Iowa. She's the author of many novels, which are listed on your program, among them Jasmine, Leave It to Me, and Holder of the World. She's the author as well of many short stories, essays, and nonfiction books. She's a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award, among many honors. When the English department looked for a fiction writer to invite to join its faculty, Bharati stood head and shoulders over the more than 200 writers we considered for the position. It was then that I first became acquainted with her work through her remarkable novel, Wife, which tells the story of a young immigrant Indian bride's development toward a consciousness of her life in which she can only murder her husband. It's a really remarkable book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. One of the major subjects of Bharati's fiction has been the experience of Indian immigrants to North America. However, she's resisted the label Asian American writer. She has said emphatically that she is an American writer of Bengali origins. She has stated that she finds the American mythology empowering, that her project as a writer involves thinking through the making of American consciousness. She has made the American language her own. In her own words, she finds it both real and foreign. In using it, she has shown us in America we've never seen before. In the epilogue to the book she has written with Clark Blaze, Days and Nights in Calcutta, Bharati writes, I write to discover ideal worlds so that I may live to repair ruined ones. It's our privilege in reading her works that we can see them both. Interviewing Bharati today is Gail Offen-Brown, herself a writer and teacher of writing. She's a lecturer in the college writing program and a teacher consultant for the Bay Area Writing Project. Please welcome Bharati Mukherjee and Gail.
Thank you very, very much, Carol and Steve, for inviting me. I do a lot of national and international lectures, readings, but nothing, no event is quite as challenging and satisfying as talking with, reading to the UC Berkeley community. When I was preparing for this afternoon, I had to decide between either reading a short story that's complete, but that's short enough not to go beyond 10 minutes, or to give you a sampling from different books, paragraphs from different books, in order to take you through the issues, events, social questions that not only obsess me, but that have also formed me as a writer. I'd like to begin by reading just a very small section from Days and Nights in Calcutta about my mother. And that'll give you a sense of the background out of which I come, where society is hierarchical and where the individual from my kind of background needs constant series of protections. My mother likes to lock doors, also windows, safes, cupboards, closets, trunks, valises. Her closest friend in Chembur has installed a padlock and chain around the door of her refrigerator. Foodstuffs such as sugar, gram flour, cloves, cardamom, and cigarettes that cannot be fitted with locks are poured into plastic canisters and placed in neat rows inside lockable cupboards. Keys to locked cupboards are stored in other locked cupboards. My mother carries only one key on her person. It is frail and black and hangs limply from a knot in her sari, just below her left shoulder. Heavier rings of keys, the ones that issue insolent challenges to potential burglars. For example, the ring of keys to get to the purse that contains the key to another cupboard and to another purse, which holds the key to a steel cabinet with a safe fitted with a double lock, where my mother has stowed my scratched German leather purse full of passports, health certificates, and the children's photographs. These remain out of sight. Clark, my husband, who by the way is sitting in the back row there, Clark considers this paranoia. He tells me that since the factory's gate office screens all those who try to enter, this elaborate security system is designed to discourage only the live-in servant and part-time maids who come to wash the dishes, do the laundry, and to clean floors and toilets. I know, of course, that Clark is wrong. He doesn't understand the apocalyptic vision of my mother. He's annoyed that he cannot get to his tape recorder without having the women unlock several cupboards, or that when he's ready and waiting in the car for the long drive downtown, it takes my mother and me several extra minutes of coordinated effort to give him his traveler's checks and identification cards. I explained to him that if the servant wanted to burgle or murder, he could easily do so during the siesta hour. My mother, though heavy, is not at all strong. She's totally at the mercy of any sinister intruder. Locking is her way of integrating belief in karma with belief in individual resourcefulness. She's alert to the conditions of modern India. She assumes that disaster, which in her childhood had seemed to lie in some unrealizable future, is now about to occur in her lifetime. She will not set herself impossible goals about reversing her fate or the country's. She will simply use her common sense to minimize the personal effects of disaster. So it's from this kind of self-defensive, self-protective, hierarchical world that I appeared in the fall of 1961 in the heart of the heartland, Iowa, at the Writers' Workshop, where for the first time in my life I saw healthy cows. It also meant that I was suddenly propelled by hormones and intellectual desires to remake my life from someone who needs locks to someone who wants to be out there and take risks. And so I'll read you a passage from Jasmine, which I know many of the students here are familiar with, just to give you that sense of passage from safety to danger. international airlines flying the world that do not appear in any directory. There are charters who've lost their way and now just fly, improvising crews and destinations. They serve no food, no beverages. Their crews often look abused. There's a shadow world of aircraft permanently aloft that share air lanes and radio frequencies with Pan Am and British Air and Air India, portaging people who coexist with tourists and businessmen. But we are refugees and mercenaries and guest workers. You see us sleeping in airport lounges. You watch us unwrapping the last of our native foods, unrolling our prayer rugs, reading our holy books, taking out for the 100th time an aerogram promising a job or space to sleep, a newspaper in our language, a photo of happier times, a passport, a visa, a laissez-passer. We are the outcasts and deportees, strange pilgrims visiting outlandish shrines, landing at the end of tarmacs, buried in old army trucks, where we are roughly handled and taken to roped-off corners of waiting rooms, where surly, barely wakened customs guards await their bride. We're dressed in shreds of national costumes, out of season, the wilted plumage of intercontinental vagabondage. We ask only one thing, to be allowed to land, to pass through, to continue. We sneak a look at the big departure board, the one the tourists use. Our cities are there. Our destinations are so close, but not yet, not so directly. We must sneak in, land by night in little used strips. For us, back behind the rope, in the corner of the waiting room, there's only a slate and someone who remembers to write in chalk, delayed, or to be announced, or out of service. We take another of our precious dollars or Swiss francs and give it to a trustworthy-looking boy and say, bring me tea and or bread. What country? What continent? We pass through wars, through plagues. I'm hungry for news, but the discarded papers are in characters or languages I cannot read. The zigzag route is straightest. And I realize in my life as a woman, as a citizen, and as a forger of language, transformer of the English language, that I too have taken the zigzag route, and I don't know where the destination is. I'm going to read you something I don't normally read, also from Jasmine, because I'm so often accused of too much sex and violence in my fiction. So this is a little romance, love story part. It's 1.5 pages. And this is, again, set in Iowa, where these days, even a blue-eyed blonde Lutheran banker may find himself shacking up with an undocumented alien from some faraway continent. Oh God, I love you so much, Bud says. I've never seen anyone so beautiful. He doesn't often make these pronouncements. They're part of his abject position, his helplessness. We're back home from Mother Ripplemeyer's. Yo's the adopted Vietnamese refugee teenager. Yo in the living room watching television. Bud and I are in the bedroom. Bud may no longer be a whole man, but desire hasn't deserted him. Lust, deprived of spontaneous fulfillment, that's what shames him now. Once he'd been in control. Once he'd been an impulsive pursuer. After I prepare him for bed, undo the shoes, pull off the pants, sponge bathe him, he likes me to change roles, from caregiver to temptress. And I try to do it convincingly, walking differently, frowning, smiling. I take off my Sunday clothes very carefully in the bathroom, with the door open, the light on. I'm to linger there and act as though I'm alone. I brush my teeth a long, long time. I rub myself against the lavatory's edge. When we first met and began making love in my rented room and in the motel rooms of neighboring towns, he was active and inventive, very sure of himself. He loved games. Now I must do all the playing, provide the surprises. I don't mind. His upper body's enormously strong, the bench press of love. It isn't the preparations that I rage against. What kills me in this half-lit bedroom is the look of torture, excitement, desperation on Bud's face as he watches me. Desire can end only one way, tonight or any other night. I come to bed, crawling over the covers, until a pair of immensely strong, blonde-haired arms enfold me. He can lift me, even from his prone position, lift me and center me and keep me in the air till I feel his arms trembling. And as my legs, my breasts, my face dip to touch his chest, I can feel the ripple of his heart. Our flesh makes loud slapping noises. Then it's my turn to take charge. There are massages I must administer, pushing him on the prostate, tools I must push up him so that, at least on very special nights, he can ejaculate. Bud's eyes are closed, face contorted. Sweet Jane, he mutters, I've brought you to this. I hush him with my lips. I do not know the pain he suffers, if any, if bliss lies this close to agony, if he's on a different plane. When love collapses, I let myself fall to his chest, and his heart is like a fist beating me wherever we touch. It's important for me to read this section because when I left Calcutta at age 20, I had never uttered the word sex. And I didn't know how males were physically constructed, even though as with so many, unclothed people living homeless on the streets of Calcutta. It was that Bengali middle-class cultural willful ignorance of sexuality. And we read at Loreto House, the school for fancy girls from fancy Bengali families in the 50s that I went to, run by Irish nuns. We read only expurgated editions of Romeo and Juliet or any other Shakespeare play. So for me and many of my characters, Indian women protagonists, the ability to assert their sexuality becomes part of the rebellion or part of self-formation. I was going to read you more, but I won't. For me, it has become a matter of writing in order to possess the city. And so the last novel was set in, Leave It to Me, is set in my neighborhood in San Francisco, the Upper Haight area. Actually, Lower Haight is where I hang out. I want you to keep reading.
Okay. You began by reading from Days and Nights in Calcutta, telling us about your mother's world. Tell us about your first memories of reading and writing. I've read that you learned to read and write when you were only 3 years old.
I probably learned before that. The act of writing is a cosmogenic and a sacred act in Hindu Bengali families like mine. And so on a special day, the day dedicated to Goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of learning, and for whom I am named, Bharati being another variant of that same name, an adult takes your hand and you guides your hand and you write the very first letter of the alphabet that you have ever written. But my mother, who hadn't been allowed to go to, who got married at 16 and a half and not allowed to sort of go out of the house, had as guerrilla tactics and literacy enthusiasts taught me to read from very young. And so I used to find little corners in this crowded household of 45 to 50 relatives, hangers-on, and so on, and devour everything. That excitement in reading is very hard to recapture. I don't know if I'll ever feel that control, that mastery over the world as words become clear.
When did you realize you were a writer? When did you first stake your claim as a writer? How did that happen?
I think I knew at age 3 because about the big things in life, I can make up my mind like that. It's the trivial things in life, like shall I buy this pair of shoes or something else, that I take years and months. But I thought I was also going to be, study organic chemistry and take over my father's pharmaceutical company. But given the era that I came from, and the kind of upper middle class, very old-fashioned, very orthodox Bengali Hindu family that I came from, I could only go to one school, which was this girls' school run by Irish nuns. And my father didn't believe in coeducational experience or being in a room with men not related to me. And so the only subjects that were offered at this school and college were English literature, French literature, and that was it. So it was women's education as conspicuous consumption. I can afford to have my daughter acquire this tremendous knowledge, and I could recite Racine and Molière by heart, but I wasn't allowed to do law, which I might have wanted. Which is why I think when I retire, the first thing I'm going to do is take the LSAT, prepare and take the LSAT exams and beat 171, which a young friend of mine was bragging about.
Did you write stories when you were young?
Yes, and I started a novel when I was 8 years old.
You started a novel when you were 8?
Yes.
That's wonderful. You mentioned in your introductory remarks your arrival in the heart of the heartland to go to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and you mentioned your hormones and your intellectual desires. But I also wondered, as you were talking about that, the introduction to language, to American English, because there's such a love of language in your writing. What was your response to absorbing American English in Iowa?
Well, my first semester, I didn't understand a word anyone said. I thought I was so fluent, and at that time, I spoke excruciatingly British, BBC kind of English, because at the school and college that I went to, inspectors, accent inspectors, came every year to check the Britishness of our accent. And elocution was the most important class, and table manners, that too was very, very important, because we were all going to be spouses of the leaders of the country. This was, not within the first 10 years of Indian independence. And so I grew up in this terribly British world, and I failed in my first semester quiz on 19th century American because I didn't understand a word the professor said. Charlie Miller, I still remember it with great dread, and he had slight deformity, which made it even more difficult for me. But for me and my characters, I think, language is the way that they order the world, they reinvent themselves, and they create themselves. And so if I had gone to England, let's say, to school, which is Girton or Newnham is where I should have been sent, Oxford or Cambridge, I think I would have been a prisoner of colonial mentality, and I could not have taken risks with language because I knew the structure, I knew what was proper and what was improper, inaccurate, and I would have been bullied by that. Whereas coming to the United States, for me, was not only a romance with democracy, but it was also invent your language as you go along. And when I finally discovered my material, that it's the South Asian or post-1965 immigrant world, fairly close to, let's say, Bernard Malamud's, I had to find a new form for fiction and a new kind of language to articulate what was still inarticulate in the informant's experience.
I especially love the names of your characters. In Wife, Dimple Dasgupta, and her friend Pixie, and Leave It to Me, Frankie Fong, who's named, of course, for Frank Sinatra, his mother, Baby Fong, who's nicknamed First Class Fong, and, of course, Jasmine, Jay's Jane. And the names are just so wonderful and rich. You spend a lot of time
Yes.
on the names.
Yes. Either they come to me, or I know why I want that name, and I feel that names are cues to the reader on how to process the tone towards the character.
You just talked about discovering your material. How did you discover your material?
I think I muddled into it without realizing what I was doing. The very first novel came out in 1971 and was called The Tiger's Daughter, and it's my Buddenbrooks, if you like, writing about my mercantile aristocratic family after its fall or fall of that class in a Calcutta that had turned from super anarchic and capitalist to communist. But Wife, even though I didn't know phrases like immigrant fiction, nor did anyone else to describe the South Asian or Asian experience in fiction in the New York publishing world, I was writing about people that I knew, that people like me who were in transition and who had to improvise the rules. So I didn't know what I was doing in Wife, but I was already sort of groping my way towards that. And then I read Malamud's selected stories at a very low point in my life. And suddenly it all clicked. My goodness, that there are many similarities between the Jewish experience of acculturation that Malamud's characters go through, and at the same time some very, very different because of color, ethnicity, language, and religion. And my first collection of stories, I came to stories very late in my life, but Darkness sort of wrote itself in 2 months. But the stories came pouring out.
Well, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the writing then. Where do you write?
There was a time when I couldn't have any other body in the house when I wrote. husband had to go away, children had to be sent up for the whole day with babysitter. Now Clark writes on the third floor and I write on the second floor, but it's a very messy, huge desk, and I'm a pathologically untidy person, but I have to have all my research notes. I do a lot of research for every single, that's the way it's turned out anyway. So I have all these file boxes piled around me, and my favorite books behind my head.
Music or quiet?
Neither. It's television, I'm afraid. It's
Television?
CNN and MSNBC. I cannot turn the television off. And I have a TV set in every single room so that I'm never out of television orbit. And some of it is, I think, I need that hit of news.
But do you have the sound on?
Yes, yes. I can't be, I'd be lonely if I didn't.
Do you keep a journal or notebook?
No, and this is something that I really regret. Clark, my partner for the last 36 years, we met in the Writers' Workshop, has always kept a notebook and a pen. And there are now thousands of these notebooks with sentences or scraps of conversation that he then feeds into his work. I think I've always worn the wrong kind of clothes. Like there are no pockets in what I'm
We're
wearing.
women, we don't have that.
Right. And so I always say to myself, if it's worthwhile, it'll stay. And of course, only a sixth stays. But it's always fascinating to me how something will well up from the unconscious just when I need it in a story. I don't keep journal.
Do you write for a certain amount of time every day, a certain number of words? Do you have a routine in terms of your writing?
I would like to have a routine, but the answer is absolutely not. I write, there is not a single moment when I'm not thinking about the work or works in progress. And I'm really constantly writing in my head, which is why one of the reasons why I don't know how to drive a car. I'd be wrecking other people's cars in no time. But when I can, on the days that I'm not teaching, let's say, I like to write from 9 to 5. And then when the local news comes on, then I want to know what's going on. It depends on the momentum of the project, what draft I'm on. And for the final draft of any novel or book, I do 22-hour days. I mean, I'm really not a human being. And Clark leaves food for me outside the door. I need to have the whole thing in my head, and that incredible energy that propels me through that final draft.
When you start a piece, do you know where it's going? Do you have a sense of the whole when you begin?
I think I know where it's going, and I'm invariably wrong. And so it's, I know that I haven't even gotten started on the right draft until the character has totally taken over. I'm hearing his or her voice, and I write from white male Vietnam vet points of view just as easily as I do from protagonists from my kind of background. But it isn't until I have become someone else and I'm hearing the sentences and the characters are putting themselves in situations that I didn't intend, that I know, okay, now the rest is easy.
So it comes from the character. You've mentioned drafts, which is something we all talk to our students about a lot, drafting. How many drafts do you do? How does revision work for you?
For novels, it's usually 3 total drafts. And I don't look at the earlier draft. It's a very weird and wasteful way of proceeding, I suppose. But for me, a draft is simply to find out what is the story I really want to tell, whose story is it that I want to tell. And sometimes who I thought was the main character will get thrown out and put in file boxes in basements of houses in Iowa, etc., Saratoga, and a very minor character will take over. So I'd say that it's not cosmetic rewriting for me, but it's thinking through each novel. And I find it very claustrophobic to actually look at the last draft.
So you say you write a draft, and then you write a completely new draft.
Because now I know.
Now you, that's what should we call it, a discovery draft. You've discovered what you want, and then you write the second one.
Yes.
And then what's the third one?
It's again.
Another, and completely.
Completely.
Okay. Where do other readers come into this process?
Other readers?
Anyone else looking at your writing?
Oh, okay. I'm a very secretive writer. And so it isn't until I feel that it's as whole as I can make it, the manuscript is as whole as I can make it, that I then let Clark, only person, read. Our 36-year marriage has been like a sustained fiction workshop. And then he'll give his feedback, and I'll listen seriously, but maybe not take all of that. Then I give a very finished product to the editor.
And then you have to go back and proof it.
Well, the copy editor,
Yeah, the copy editor.
will then, especially at places like Houghton Mifflin or Knopf, it has to be a special mental faculty where they can find incredible errors. And so I'll have to fix someone who's wearing pink shoes on page 5 suddenly has purple shoes on page 7. So those kinds of catching the errors.
I have two questions that my students wanted me to ask you, and there'll be time at the end for everyone to ask questions. That is, they wanted to know, do you ever get stuck? Do you ever get writer's block? And how to cope with that? And also, if you ever procrastinate. Why would students be asking these questions?
No to the first.
No to the first. You
Yes,
never
yes
get
to
stuck.
the second. My problem is just finding time. I write as easily in the red carpet lounges of airports as the United Airlines red carpet lounge as I do at home. All I need is my laptop, and there are just thousands of stories. I mean, it must be a form of madness that they're all competing. And, if I weren't going to take the LSAT exams, I'd write more stories. The procrastination, yes. I'm afraid that I think, put off, and then the deadline is like a hit, and I will put in, 36 hours in order to get an essay down.
Like our students pulling all-nighters.
Yes.
Yeah.
I understand that totally.
Well, you brought up the issue of time, and I'm just amazed. You're a writer, you're a professor, you're a parent, you have a partner. How do you negotiate among all that? How do you balance all those roles? How do you make a place for writing in your life?
I think if I had not married a fellow writer, if I'd married a CEO in a Silicon Valley company, I would probably be a very different kind of writer. Writing would have to be a hobby, and it would be decorative writing, so that we've made our schedules and our lives very flexible in order for both of us to take what time is necessary. But the real answer is that by not thinking about it, the children happened while I wasn't looking. Same with marriage. Some of my students know that ours was a 2-week courtship, and we got married during a lunch break in a lawyer's office above the coffee shop where we were having soup and sandwich. So the big things happen fast.
So you're saying because you're both writers, you put writing first in your lives, both of you do.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this brings me to another area I've been wanting to ask you about, which is that you've co-written a number of texts. You've written 2 nonfiction works, Days and Nights in Calcutta and Sorrow and the Terror, and some essays. I know the piece on Salman Rushdie. How does that work, the co-writing? How does the process work, collaborative writing?
I'll bring Clark in on this to contradict me if necessary. The first book, Days and Nights in Calcutta, was meant to be a chronicle or journal of a year sabbatical that we were spending with my family in India in 73, 74. And the contract with Doubleday required us not to discuss our experiences, not to compare notes. And the idea was that we would sit at the Doubleday office in Manhattan, and the 3 of us, editor plus the 2 writers, would decide how to structure this work. But it became for me a kind of accidental autobiography when I was, with too much passion, too much rage, working through questions of expatriation, immigration, and it was also a time, the 70s was a decade, shameful decade, I think, in Canadian immigration history, when non-white Canadian citizens like me were physically harassed on a daily basis, and there was not a constitution or Bill of Rights in Canada at that time that could guarantee trying to get redress. So it was, the book was written under incredible pressure, and so we kept the 2 halves totally separate. The Sorrow and the Terror, which is an investigative book on the terrorist bombing of an Air India jet, which had 329 people on board, most of whom were Canadian citizens of Indian origin, and the perpetrators were also Canadian citizens of Indian origin. Khalistani, they wanted a separate state, religious state in part of Punjab. That was a real collaboration where we had to agree on every single sentence. And the stakes were very high. And the Viking Penguin lawyer had to go through every sentence. And we were put under death threat for several years. And, it's the book, and it's now out of print, but it's the book that totally changed me as a writer. I cannot write entertaining fiction. I cannot write decorative fiction anymore. Some of you may have read in anthologies, The Management of Grief. That's the most anthologized of my stories. And that came out of this investigative book that we did. And it was the whole listening to the bereaved and the listening to these members, alleged perpetrators who were very gabby when we were researching, then got very upset when the book came out, was so painful that the story came out in 1.5 sittings. I wrote the whole thing and then showed it to Clark, and he said, I think the concluding paragraphs need change. You need a different kind of ending. And so the next morning I went back, rewrote the ending, and let me say.
And that's all.
Yeah. because I was so ready to, I was living that
When I read
experience.
the book, I was just amazed at how at the context that you had, that these people, so many people were willing to talk to you, especially the alleged perpetrators.
And you know, we never thought of ourselves as people who would be doing thoroughly detective work. I never thought that we would be able to actually track down the alleged financier of the bombing. But it was seeing that tragedy and the handling by the Canadian government, especially the Prime Minister of that time, Brian Mulroney, and the neglect of that incident by the Canadian press that made me realize this was not a story about whodunit. It was a story about failed models of immigration, that there is a heinous aspect to the model of mosaic acculturation, especially if you decide that there are some cultures to be valued, meaning Western European, Anglo-Saxon first, and Western European, and some to be devalued, and you're not going to allow any kind of fluidity, porousness, interaction between fusion between the cultures.
As someone who writes both fiction and nonfiction, and I was actually, my questions, I was thinking of the management of grief and so, in conjunction with sorrow and the terror. What can you do in one form that you can't in the other? What is it that impels you for some material to go in one genre, some material to go in another?
I think in essays, I'm directly polemic, and I have positions about immigration, expatriation, that I feel very, very, citizenship, nationhood, that I feel very strongly about, and I can write directly about them. And of course, my essays always get me in trouble with expatriate orthodoxy. But in fiction, you're creating a whole world in which, as author, you want to distribute sympathy impartially to all the characters. I don't want a schematic setup in which all brown people are victim, all white people are victimizers, or good guys versus bad guys. I have to have a vision that's larger, more tolerant.
Did you feel that you needed to write management of grief after you had done the research? Did you write it soon? I don't have the time sequence. Did you write it soon after you had written the other?
I think about 9 months later. And the book of stories that won the prize and that changed my life in some ways was conceived as a book, not as putting together random stories. And so I knew that I had to do that story, and that was the last story that I wrote for that collection.
If the fiction comes from the character, what impels the nonfiction for you?
Issues. I mean, I'm obsessive about the ways in which Asian immigrants have to be included in the discourse on race, class, affirmative action, and so on. And I was on a panel with Cornel West, Toni Morrison, David Wang, and one token white guy, Richard Ford, at the Field Museum in Chicago for the 1996 Democratic Convention. And that's where, I realized that it is so necessary to derail some of the, or not derail, that the traditional discourse on race in this country has been black and white, and that we now have to enlarge it in order to be more inclusive of other groups, that the America post-1965 given the porousness of our borders, is very, very different. And I get upset with those new immigrants, South Asians are among these groups, who feel that because we have come late in a U.S. history of racial animosities, racial oppression, that we are somehow privileged and we're innocent. Whereas I take my citizenship very seriously, and I say, if I'm going to be an American, it means taking on the guilt and the strengths of all U.S. history, and that I cannot exempt myself or my group from what is, from the oppressions that have occurred. And, you know, I take my citizenship, I guess, very seriously.
Is this what impelled the essay, American Dreamer?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. And I really have a great deal of trouble with the U.S. bashers from South Asia, people with very similar backgrounds to mine, who make their living off the capitalist system, who are earning $200,000 a year with big chairs at Ivy League schools, but who have the position of we are above it, we are aloof. And I called this in an essay, Imagining Homelands, for a book, Letter of Transit, that the expatriate's position is one of majesty and aloofness. I'm above it all, I'm not sullied by any of it. Whereas the immigrant's position acknowledges a kind of violent dislocation and a violent deformation and reformation. And it's ugly, it's damaging, but at the same time, it's mongrelized culture, impure, and at the same time, the more energetic and the more honest.
I think a lot of the words you just used can be used to describe your own fiction, your own novel. And I wanted to ask you, in that piece and in other places, I know that you resist being characterized as a hyphenated, you resist hyphenation, you reject it. How do you characterize yourself as a writer?
I'm a new third thing. I think we all have fluid identities, series of fluid identities, and that Asian American doesn't apply to that part of my work where I'm not making what it means to be Asian American the central thesis. And there's no such thing. I mean, the phrase Asian American is a marketing tool, whether it's in ethnic studies departments or by publishers. There's no common ground in terms of religion, race, ethnicity, and generational immigration history between someone like me and, let's say, my wonderful colleague and magnificent writer, Maxine Hong Kingston. But it's necessary for the Terry Grosses and so on to lump us together.
Well, I won't lump you together, I promise. I promise. What I'm really interested in hearing is how this plays itself out in your writing, in your language, in your narrative, which is, I think, could also be described as cultural fusion. You talk about immigrants as pioneers, and it seems to me you're very much a literary pioneer in your work with the novel.
Yeah, I mean, I really need to invent a particular form of the novel where I want to deal, because that's the world of passion that I live in, with epic material, but I'm also part of the half-hour loops, CNN, and MTV, so I want the art of compression. Isaac Babel is one of my role models. And so I want to squeeze into 200 pages what in the 19th century was deliberately the narrative tradition of European novels in the 19th century was spelling out every transition. So it's a jamming together where not a single word or comma is wasted. Isaac Babel said that a well-placed comma should stab the heart. And I keep that in my heart as I sit down at the laptop. I started, writing with a pen, fountain pen, and in those days, sentences sort of in that British fashion, a facility with language, sentences just came fully formed and didn't need to be scratched out. As I've given up fountain pen, I moved on to, because no one in Iowa would take handwritten essays. So when I moved to typewriter, I found that the rhythm was very different. Selectric, when I graduated to that, it meant I could do a lot of cut and paste and erasure. And now with laptop, Clark and I were one of the early batch of writers to get into K-Pros in those days, and very clumsy programs like Executive Secretary. And that the form of the novel for me has changed because I can move blocks around. I just can't think linear anymore.
And your syntax have changed as well.
Totally, yes. And it's the high-octane energy. One of the people I like to read for pleasure is James Elroy. And it's that kind of, I feel that my characters are living 400 years as I am too, in 40 minutes. And so trying to get that energy level.
In your essay on Salman Rushdie, you quote Rushdie as saying, "The secret is in the sentence, isn't it? A sentence that begins in the Middle Ages and ends in the 21st century." Do you feel that describes your writing as well?
Yeah. I wish I'd said it instead of Salman.
Yeah. But you quoted him. It's in a wonderful sentence.
This was when the fatwa was already in place against Salman Rushdie for the satanic verses. And, it was very secret, hush-hush, but he would leave messages on our tape. And Clark and I were writing for Mother Jones an investigative article on were the publishers going to, the British phrase is paperback, issue a paperback of satanic verses given all the physical violence and the harassments that had gone on. And we went to England to research, to interview people, thinking that we were typical American free speech fundamentalists, and came out with a very, very different kind of understanding of the situation. We interviewed at great length a guy who's exactly the same Muslim from Bradford, very, not a fancy town, and he was not from a fancy neighborhood of Bradford, but exactly the same age as Rushdie, who had organized the book burning in Bradford. And he said, look, if there hadn't been a Rushdie, if there hadn't been a Satanic Verses, we would have had to create one, because it's not about this man or this book, but it's about getting attention for the acculturation, the Anglicized, Britishizing of the Muslim children in British schools. And that if you want to hang on to power, you have to enforce the old cultural ways. And that Rushdie is totally irrelevant to the situation. We also, thanks to Clark, we unearthed incredible documents from the liberators, the word, Viking Penguin saying in private among their board of directors, and it's owned by Pearson PLC, their trustees, that some rights are worth defending, but not this one when oil wells in Saudi Arabia or wherever are involved. But in public, the publishers were saying, yes, yes, we intend to bring out the paperback. So then we got in a lot of trouble with Peter Mayer, who was then head of Viking Penguin.
Well, this brings up a question of audience. What do you think of audience as you write? When you were writing a piece like this, which you knew was controversial, did you think of that at all?
For essays, yes, I'm more conscious of an audience. And, you know, I don't know how to be diplomatic or sit on the fence about these ideas, so that whether I like it or not, they come out in a particularly excited, agitated way. For fiction, I think of my target audience as American readers like me. And I think of an editor sitting in New York as the kind of person whom I have to make some of my material understandable, accessible to. But that's after I've written, I think of these things. When I'm writing, when it's really going well, the character is doing all that. I am the audience and the character is the speaker writer.
That's unclear. Do you ever imagine your characters reading your stories? Do you imagine Jasmine or
Jasmine has
Debbie?
lives of her own, yes, yes. I don't think they read. Jasmine's not a reader, but they go on, they live. And I want to think of the last three novels as really a trilogy, because they are different versions of how to cope with diaspora and chaos, and they're very strong women.
What do you expect of your readers in the sense that for many readers, there will be much that's unfamiliar in the works, references to Indian culture, places. What do you expect of the readers?
I want the narrative energy to do most of the explication, and this is where I think Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, having come out in the early 80s, is a boon for many of us immigrant writers. He gives you whole paragraphs on Bombay using Indianized English without ever explaining. And I think if the narrative force is strong enough, you shouldn't have to hold up the narrative. And I want to think that because of people like me, and there are hundreds of thousands from different cultures and languages, that whatever words we bring to this continent should become part of the general vocabulary.
This brings me to another question, and it's about our students, and that is many of our students have a number of languages and cultural backgrounds to draw upon. And for you, it's maybe who you are as a writer. But I think some of them, I know from my experience in teaching writing, feel that they have to repress those parts of themselves in order to achieve academic success. And what would you say to those students?
What a pity that I don't know about academic success. I mean, what I find very troubling is the wholesale adoption of certain kind of culture theory vocabulary and the obfuscation of the ideas through thicket of jargonized language. So if by repressing you mean that they just take on the vocabulary, then I think that's a dreadful pity. But if it's simply, how do I mesh my Hindu myths with Greek myths and so on, then I think that over the years it just works its way out. I find myself doing that in Leave It to Me, for example. Electra plus the baby. Yeah.
Well, speaking of students, I think it's time to let you ask questions.
Steve. I'm sorry, but I really have to hear a little more about the collaboration. We sort of got to the point where you two were writing separate things and then meeting with the editor about days and nights in Calcutta.
I'm here. What do you want me to say?
So,
Your take on
how did that work? We didn't sort of hear an end to. Did you all fight? Did you just write separate? Did you stick to the rule that you were supposed to write separately?
We started off that we didn't share any of our experiences or notes, and
we wrote two separate halves. But we never sat with the editor. I knew that I wanted mine intact because it had become a very different project from what the original contract specified. Clark, do you want to talk a little bit?
Well, I think one of the interesting parts is that 20 years after it went out of print in its original Doubleday edition, it was brought back into print by a little publishing house in Minnesota called Hungry Mind, and they asked us to do new introduction, new afterward. Maybe that's for sale here, I don't know. And that the book had by then passed from being a travel book in which it was up-to-date information to being literature. I mean, it was now no longer a worthwhile travel guide because India has changed in the 30 years between. India has changed unrecognizably, including Calcutta even. And so that I was pleased simply to see that what had started out with an urgent agenda of writing a responsible travel book for the Western reader has now become a character study of a marriage. So it's read now as a marriage in an exotic place, but it's not really seen anymore as anything that terribly exotic, and it's quite wonderfully so, because it's not. It would be very unreliable to use that as a book to take your bearings from in modern India. So that's my own aside.
well, following up on the collaboration, do you ever disagree?
Yes,
What
especially when
happens?
we've done two screenplays, and I won't ever, I don't think.
How do you negotiate that?
We fight. And one or the other wins. The other sulks.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're human. Comforts the rest of us. Other questions?
I have a question. You initially talked about taking the LSAT. In your next life, what will that be after the LSAT?
I like taking tests.
Oh, okay.
No, I had signed up for law school at McGill when I was also director of graduate studies in the English department, because I wanted so much to change to reform immigration policy. And then I realized, one, that the students were so much more competitive than I was. They were tearing pages out of library books so that the next reader couldn't get there. And two, that the government was encouraging me in order to repress immigration rather than champion them. So I realized that I could reach more people through my writing than going to law school. Yeah.
How did you get into how did you get into the mindset of the of the terrorists, because it seemed at some points like the writing was almost coming from their voice. Not quite, but it seemed like at times it was very close to sort of expressing their mindset.
We interviewed all these terrorists and supporters, sympathizers, at very great length. And I think that that's where being a fiction writer lets you enter a consciousness, lets you enter a personality. We have in that book interviews with all 5 members of Double Blind Cell. I don't ever want to, we were Lois Lane and Clark Kent going into it, you know. I don't ever want to do that sort of book again. But they were all, not all, but the guy who I think financed it was a fascinating man who was was a Dostoevskian character. And being able to see him as not just a killer, but as a Dostoevskian killer helped.
Right. I have a question. As somebody who's about to graduate from Berkeley and possibly, if I don't get into grad school, creative writing float around for a while, what sort of community of writers is there in the Bay Area? Or is there really? I mean, what resources did you find useful for yourself outside of the university setting?
Yes, the answer is there's very definitely young and vigorous community of writers, as well as the established who may not get together that often. And I'm aware of how many of the students who were in Berkeley fiction writing workshops, then once they'd taken all the courses and could not retake them, set up their own workshop meeting once every 2 weeks. And it's gone on now for about 7 years. And there's a satellite of the workshop in the Haight area, too. But I need to be near a terrific library. That's why the Columbia Library, the Berkeley Library, the Iowa Library has always been very important to me. You know, for every half sentence that I may casually mention, day mummies, day caregivers from, let's say, the islands, working for professors, families, looking after the children at Columbia in Jasmine. I read every single published and unpublished dissertation on the relationships between the feminist white women whose careers in those years was really formed on the underpaid backs, resentful backs of these women who'd left their children either with grandmother or way back in the islands. It was the Zoe Baird syndrome that I was seeing in the articles. And so it just gives me confidence. I don't look at the notes once I'm done, but I need to know everything so that the details surface.
You mentioned that you thought the mosaic metaphor for immigration was very unsatisfactory to you. Do you have another or another idea, another phrase or metaphor to replace it?
Yes, chutnification, to borrow one of Salman Rushdie's images from Midnight's Children, or the pickling jar, that you put in carrots, cucumbers, whatever, cauliflower bits, into this pickling liquid, and you come out not exactly not the texture that the vegetables had when they were in the original, but you've been changed by that pickling liquid. So I'm looking for something that is not anti-pollution. To think that all cultural erosion is loss, cultural change is loss, to me is wrong. That there is bound to be some kind of change, and you must be prepared for that change if you've made your decision to live in this country, or in any country. And once you move from the original culture, you have to be prepared for long-term consequences of erosion and change. And, you know, the original country, especially India, has so socially transformed itself. But many of the immigrants who came in 1972, that was a very popular year, have a frozen image of what the culture is, and quite often are far more old-fashioned than families in urban centers in India. Melting pot was never a reality, but mongrelization is the word I use, as opposed to hybridization, because hybrid seems to me a planned scientific experiment. I'm going to put in a little bit of this, a little strain of that, whereas mongrel is, you know, serendipitous. It happens, and then you deal with it.
We have time for one more question.
What kind of projects are you currently working on?
I'm doing a large generational novel called Desirable Daughters, which starts out in the last quarter of the 19th century in what is now Bangladesh, but where my family, both parents, were born. But the main action takes place in the 90s in Detroit. Maybe it'll become New Jersey instead. San Francisco and Bombay. It's about three sisters who make very, very different choices about marriage, pursuit of personal happiness, and so on.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to reading that when it comes out. Let people know that there's a table run by the ASUC over here where you can purchase Professor Mukherjee's works. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Steve Tollefson, for organizing this event. And of course, most of all, thank you, Bharati Mukherjee. Thank you so much.